All right, welcome in, everybody. We're going to be taking a deep dive into Hebrews 4:14 to 16 today.
Okay.
Now, we know you guys are all familiar with the verse itself. You're out there leading Bible studies and giving sermons every week.
Yeah.
So we wanted to go a little deeper and find some of those non-obvious angles for you guys.
Right.
What we've got is basically a whole stack of sermon notes and analyses from different pastors tackling this passage. And honestly, the sheer variety in these interpretations, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is fascinating to see how, despite the different approaches, there is that core thread that kind of runs through them all.
For sure.
Like, it's not just about what the verse says, but how it can be applied in all these, really diverse ways to actually connect with people's lives.
Totally.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like everyone's found a different facet of the same diamond.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me right away was this emphasis on Jesus' continuous intercession and empathy. Like Equiper Central Coast, they had this whole sermon on how Jesus didn't just check out after his earthly ministry.
Right.
He's still actively involved. He's checking in on us.
Yeah, that's a really powerful shift in perspective, I think, for a lot of people.
For sure.
Just moving away from that idea of Jesus as just a historical figure.
Right.
To understanding him as this constant support in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
I think for someone who's really struggling with doubt or discouragement, that idea of this always-on support from Jesus, that could be a lifeline for them.
Totally. But some pastors took this idea even further, too. Summit Heights Methodist Church. They really dove deep into that Greek word sympathos.
Yes.
And it's not just that Jesus, feels for us,
right,
but he feels with us.
Exactly.
What do you think is the significance of that distinction?
I think it's huge.
Yeah.
Because sympathos, it suggests this much deeper, relational understanding of our struggles.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just pity, it's actually a shared experience.
Yeah.
Think about it. If someone is just feeling for you, they're on the outside looking in.
Right.
But when they feel with you, they're right there in the trenches with you.
For sure.
And that's how Jesus approaches our struggles.
Mm-hmm.
He's not aloof or detached.
Right.
He's right there with us, experiencing the rawness of our pain.
And that leads so well into the next theme, which is suffering.
Yes.
I was so impressed with how Menlo Church tackled this, especially their focus on finding purpose in suffering.
Yes.
Connecting Jesus' Gethsemane prayer to our own struggles.
Right.
Not shying away from the tough stuff.
Yes. And I really appreciate how they didn't just fall back on these simplistic platitudes,
Yeah.
Pain is good or,
right.
or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
They really acknowledge the complexity of suffering and how it can just feel so pointless and unfair sometimes.
Totally.
But then they brought in this incredible quote from Rocky Balboa, of all things.
What was it?
It's, it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward.
Wow. I love that.
Talk about connecting with a secular audience, right?
Totally. Taking something so recognizable, even from pop culture,
right,
and using it to just completely illuminate this spiritual truth.
Exactly.
I love it. And then, on a lighter note, there were some truly creative analogies in these sermons.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Life Church comparing Jesus to Optimus Prime.
Yeah, what?
I got to admit, my initial reaction was wait, what?
Yeah, I had the same thought.
But then, when you actually dig into it, it's actually a pretty brilliant way to communicate transformation.
Especially for a younger generation.
Right, especially for a younger generation.
Yeah.
Optimus Prime is, this powerful force for good.
Yeah.
But he can also transform and adapt to any situation.
Right.
Isn't that the perfect picture of how Jesus works in our lives?
Absolutely, yeah.
He meets us where we are. But he also empowers us to become something more.
Exactly.
It's so good. And it's definitely memorable.
Yeah, for sure.
Then there was AHOP Church TV.
Yeah.
Illustrating God's grace with abundant mashed potatoes at a family dinner.
Okay, that one I laughed out loud.
Seriously?
Yeah.
I don't know if I saw that one.
But you know what? It works.
Really?
It's lighthearted.
Okay.
It's relatable. And it gets the point across.
Yeah.
God's grace isn't just a teaspoonful. It's this overflowing all-you-can-eat buffet.
I love that.
And that kind of abundance that can really resonate with people.
Totally. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's awesome.
Yeah. It really just highlights that generosity of God's love, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just this limited resource,
right.
carefully measured out.
Right.
It's poured out freely and lavishly.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that abundance ties in so well with the theme of prevailing prayer and active grace.
Mm-hmm.
River of Life Church, Virginia really stood out to me with their approach to this.
Oh, yeah.
They talked about approaching prayer with VIP passes and trouble tickets.
Oh, I loved that analogy.
Yeah.
It just reframes prayer as this like active engagement with God.
Yeah.
Rather than just like passive begging.
Yeah.
It's not about groveling or feeling unworthy, It's about recognizing that through Christ, we have that direct access to the throne of grace.
Totally.
And those VIP passes are like this powerful visual reminder of our standing before God.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that could really resonate with people who struggle with feeling inadequate or undeserving of God's attention.
For sure.
Like they're always waiting in the general admission line, just hoping to get a glimpse.
Right.
But the reality is we have a right to be there.
We do, absolutely. Yeah. And the trouble tickets concept is equally insightful.
Yeah.
It's a way of presenting our needs to God boldly and confidently, knowing He cares and He wants to help.
But it's not just about presenting our problems, is it? Limitless Church California made this really fascinating distinction between grace as unmerited favor and grace as an empowering force.
Yes.
They called it active grace.
Right, and that's a key takeaway from Hebrews 4:14-16.
For sure.
Like, it's not enough to just receive God's mercy. We're also called to find grace that helps us in our time of need.
Right.
It's about being equipped and empowered to overcome challenges, to live differently.
So it's not just about forgiveness.
Right.
It's about transformation.
Exactly.
I can see how that concept would be incredibly encouraging for people struggling with habitual sin or feeling stuck in their spiritual lives.
Oh, absolutely. It gives us a whole new perspective on what it means to live in God's grace. It's not passive. It's dynamic. It's not just about being cleansed from the past.
Right.
It's about being empowered for the future.
It is. Now, while these modern analogies are definitely helpful, it's also important to ground our understanding of Hebrews 4:14-16 in its historical context.
Oh, for sure.
Several sermons connected this passage back to the Old Testament, particularly the role of the high priest and the Day of Atonement.
Right.
How essential do you think that is for a modern audience?
I think it adds a richness and depth to our understanding that we wouldn't get otherwise, especially for those who may not be as familiar with the Old Testament rituals.
Yeah.
Imagine you're watching like a movie sequel without having seen the original.
Okay.
You might enjoy the story on its own, but you'd miss out on all those callbacks, all the nuances, the deeper meaning that comes from understanding that backstory.
It's like those Easter eggs hidden in movies.
Exactly.
That only the true fans will catch.
Yes. And the same goes for Hebrews 4:14-16.
Okay.
When we understand that historical context,
Yeah.
we can see how Jesus fulfills the role of the high priest in this way that's far more profound than we might initially realize.
I love that. So walk us through that a bit. What are some of the key connections between this passage and the Old Testament rituals?
Yeah.
I think our listeners would really appreciate a quick refresher.
Yeah. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, to offer a sacrifice for the sins of the people. It was a once-a-year event, shrouded in ritual and symbolism. Now in Hebrews, we see Jesus as our high priest, entering the heavenly Holy of Holies, not with the blood of animals, but with his own blood.
And that sacrifice is once and for all, right?
Exactly.
We don't need a new high priest every year.
Right.
Jesus' sacrifice is eternal.
Yes. And it's through his sacrifice that we have access to God's grace and mercy. It's this beautiful picture of continuity and fulfillment.
Yeah.
The Old Testament rituals weren't just arbitrary.
Yeah.
They were pointing forward to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ.
I think that's so important for Christians to understand, especially those who come from a Jewish background.
Absolutely.
It's not about abandoning the Old Testament. It's about seeing how it all points to Jesus.
It's about understanding the richness and depth of God's plan throughout history.
I love that. So we've got Jesus as our always-on advocate. We've got this incredible access to God's throne.
Yes.
And we've got grace that empowers us to live differently. What really stood out to you from all these different sermons and analyses?
One thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea of confidence.
Okay.
Not just confidence in our salvation, but confidence in approaching God.
Yeah, that was a big theme, wasn't it?
It really was.
So many pastors touched on that. Why do you think that's so important?
Because so often we come to God with this sense of timidity, of unworthiness. We're afraid to ask for what we need. We're afraid to be honest about our struggles. But Hebrews 4:14-16, it's an invitation to come boldly into God's presence. It's a reminder that we're not just servants.
Right.
We're sons and daughters.
We're heirs to the throne.
Exactly. And that changes everything.
Mm.
It allows us to approach God with this sense of intimacy and familiarity.
Right.
We can be real with him. We can be vulnerable. We can be honest. We don't have to pretend to have it all together.
We can ask for what we need knowing. He wants to give us good gifts.
Yes. And that's where the idea of active grace comes in again. We're not just passively waiting for God to fix everything.
Yeah.
We're actively partnering with him, seeking his guidance and empowerment.
It's like a dance, isn't it?
I love that.
We take a step towards him.
Yeah.
He takes a step towards us.
Yeah. I love that analogy. It's a beautiful picture of the relationship we're invited into.
Yeah.
It really is. And I think that sense of partnership is so key to understanding the transformative power of grace.
Totally.
It's not just about receiving forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's about allowing God to work in us, to change us from the inside out. Several pastors touched on this, but Limitless Church California had this really cool illustration about a class on fire making.
Oh, yeah? What was that?
The one where all the students are struggling to get a spark,
Right.
but then the teacher comes alongside them
Yeah.
and suddenly they're able to start the fire.
I remember that.
That was such a good way to illustrate how God's grace works.
Yeah.
Like, we have the potential, but sometimes we need his guidance, his empowering touch to ignite it.
It is. It makes me think about all those times I've tried to like muscle through things on my own strength,
Yeah.
you know? And I just end up exhausted and discouraged.
For sure.
It's a good reminder to lean into that partnership, to invite God into the process.
It is. And that ties back to approaching God's throne with confidence. We don't have to earn our way there. We've already been given access through Christ.
Yeah.
Remember those VIP passes from River of Life Church?
Oh, yeah.
They're not just for show.
All right.
They're for using.
It's about walking through that open door,
Yeah.
boldly asking for what we need, knowing that we're welcomed and loved. I think that's such an important message for our congregations to hear.
Absolutely.
Because so often we get so bogged down in the do's and don'ts of Christianity that we forget about the incredible gift of grace that's available to us.
It's so true. And when we truly grasp that grace, it changes everything. It frees us from fear.
Yeah.
It empowers us to serve. And it gives us hope. It allows us to extend that same grace to others, to meet them in their struggles with compassion and understanding.
So good. You know, listening to all these different sermons and analyses has been so inspiring.
It really has.
Each pastor found such unique ways to connect with their congregation,
Yeah.
to bring this familiar passage to life.
Absolutely. And I think the creative analogies and illustrations were especially effective.
They were.
Like, I'll never forget that image of Optimus Prime transforming our lives. It's just so unexpected and yet so powerful.
It is. Or the overflowing mashed potatoes representing God's abundant grace.
Right.
It makes you smile,
Yeah,
but it also drives home the point.
for sure.
It's all about finding those unique hooks, those unexpected connections that will resonate with your audience.
And I think that's a key takeaway for anyone who's preaching or teaching. Don't be afraid to think outside the box. Find those fresh, engaging ways to communicate these timeless truths.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? Hebrews 4:14-16, it isn't just a verse to memorize.
Right.
It's a launch pad for connecting with your congregation in deeply personal ways. The key is to go beyond the surface and find the angles that resonate most authentically with your audience.
I love that. If you were to pick one unconventional analogy or illustration to bring Hebrews 4:14-16 to life for your community, what would it be and why? That's something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive.